The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that felt alive, charged with anticipation. Emily stood in the witness box, her hands gripping the wooden railing so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but she forced herself to speak, her voice slicing through the stillness like a blade. "Your Honor, I know what happened to my brother." Gasps rippled through the room like a shockwave. Heads snapped toward the teenage girl standing under the harsh courtroom lights. Some jurors shifted in their seats, whispering, their faces shifting between curiosity and confusion. In the front row, her father shot up from his chair, his face drained of color. "Emily, no!" His voice cracked with panic, a raw desperation twisting his features. Emily swallowed hard, ignoring the fear clawing at her throat. She had kept this secret for too long. She couldn't do it anymore. "I can't keep quiet anymore," she continued, her voice stronger now, though her hands still trembled. "Everyone deserves to know the truth." The judge banged her gavel sharply, demanding order, but the murmurs had already spread through the room like wildfire. The tension in the air thickened. Emily's mother covered her mouth with both hands, shaking her head in disbelief. The jury exchanged uneasy glances. Even the defense attorney, an experienced man who had likely heard every kind of testimony, looked momentarily stunned. Emily turned her gaze to the microphone, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet every word carried. "He didn't disappear. He didn't run away." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I know exactly what happened, and I know who's responsible." Another wave of gasps crashed through the room, louder this time. The air crackled with suspense. The judge's call for silence was drowned out by the whispers and shifting bodies. But Emily didn't hear any of it anymore, because in that moment, she saw him, a figure in the back of the courtroom, a face she never expected to see again. Her breath caught. Her throat tightened. The words she was about to say died on her lips. Chaos erupted around her, reporters scrambling to take notes, lawyers shouting objections, the judge banging her gavel furiously. But Emily couldn't move, couldn't speak. She just stood there, frozen, staring at the figure sitting near the back. Her father's voice cut through the noise, calling her name, but she barely registered it. Because she knew exactly who she was looking at. 2 years ago, life was simple, normal. Emily had a brother, Jason. Annoying, hilarious, her best friend. He stole bites of her food at breakfast, teased her about never beating him at cards, and helped her with math, even though he always made it seem way harder than it was. That evening had been no different. Jason had been upstairs getting ready for soccer practice while Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, finishing her homework before dinner. She heard his familiar footsteps creaking in the hallway. "Hey, wanna play a quick game?" she called, shuffling a deck of cards in her hands. Jason had laughed. "Only if you're ready to lose again." Emily rolled her eyes. "You're just scared." But he only smirked, shaking his head. "Not tonight, Em. Gotta go." And then, he was gone. At first, no one noticed anything was wrong. Their dad was late getting home as usual. Their mom was in the kitchen, humming softly while stirring a pot of spaghetti. Emily figured Jason had left for practice like he always did. But then, hours passed, and he didn't come back. Their mom checked his room first, calling his name. Silence. Then their dad joined the search, his voice sharper, more impatient. Jason's soccer bag was missing, but his phone still sat untouched on his nightstand. Emily remembered the way the panic grew, how her mother's voice cracked when she called the police, the way her father clenched his jaw, trying to hold himself together. The first few days were a blur of officers questioning neighbors, posters going up on streetlights, and volunteers searching the nearby woods. But there was nothing. Jason was just gone. Days turned into weeks. The police followed leads that went nowhere. Friends whispered theories in hushed voices at school. Someone claimed they saw Jason get into a car. Another swore he had been spotted at a bus station miles away. And then, just like that, the police stopped looking. Their official statement? Jason had probably run away. No evidence of foul play. Case closed. But Emily never believed that. Jason wouldn't have left her. Not without a word. Not without a fight. The house became unbearably quiet. Their mother cried herself to sleep most nights, barely eating, barely functioning. Their father threw himself into work, avoiding the topic altogether. And Emily sat alone in Jason's room, staring at the walls, breathing in the faint scent of his cologne, willing herself to hear his voice again. She felt it deep in her bones. Something was wrong. Jason didn't just disappear. Someone had made him disappear. The grief never got easier, but after a few months, Emily learned to live with the silence. The house still felt hollow. Her mother still barely spoke. And her father, he acted like Jason had never existed. That was what made her suspicious. It wasn't just avoidance, it was something else. A cold, calculated effort to move on, to erase Jason from their lives. And then, one night she found it. She had been in her father's office looking for an old photo album when she came across a locked drawer in his desk. He never locked anything. That alone sent a chill up her spine. She jimmied it open with a letter opener, heart hammering, hands shaking. Inside was a mess of papers, legal documents, and at the very back, a single crumpled receipt. Emily unfolded it carefully, her breath catching as her eyes scanned the date. The day Jason disappeared. She swallowed hard. It was from a gas station, not from their town, not from anywhere near his office. It was hours away. Her father had never mentioned being out of town that day. Her stomach twisted as she tried to make sense of it. What was he doing so far from home? And why had he hidden this? Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this was important, that this was the piece of the puzzle she had been missing. She started digging. Over the next few weeks, she went through everything. Old photo albums, stacks of paperwork, even the drawers in her father's nightstand. She searched his office when he wasn't home, scrolling through his files, skimming every piece of paper that looked remotely suspicious. When she couldn't find anything there, she tried to hack into his computer. She wasn't exactly tech-savvy, but she knew enough to guess at his passwords. Jason's birthday. Emily's birthday. Their mother's name. Nothing worked. She was close. She could feel it. But she was also running out of time. Her father had started noticing the way she watched him, the way she asked questions. At dinner, he would narrow his eyes at her, studying her too carefully, as if he knew she was onto something. Her mother thought she was acting out from grief. Maybe that was true. But Emily wasn't just chasing ghosts. She was uncovering something real. And now, standing in the courtroom, she felt the weight of everything she had discovered pressing down on her. She met her father's gaze from across the room. For the first time, she saw it. Not just anger, fear. Before she could say another word, movement in the back of the courtroom caught her eye. A figure stood up, stepping into the light. Emily's breath hitched. Everything around her faded. The judge, the jury, the case itself. Because standing there, alive and real, was Jason. Emily. The voice was steady but low, cutting through the heavy courtroom air like a blade. Her entire body went still. The world tilted. She had spent 2 years imagining this moment, dreaming of it, aching for it. But now that it was happening, it felt unreal, like she was trapped in some cruel trick of her own mind. She turned slowly, her breath shallow, her heart pounding against her ribs. There he was. Jason. Gaunt. Paler than she remembered. His face was thinner, his features sharper, but there was no mistaking it. Her mother let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. She swayed in her seat as if she might faint. Her father didn't move. His entire body had gone rigid, his face blank, except for his eyes. Those eyes weren't shocked. They were calculating. Emily barely found her voice. It came out as a whisper. "Jason?" The room erupted. Reporters scrambled to their feet, pens flying across notepads, cameras flashing in a chaotic frenzy. Jurors murmured in confusion. The defense attorney shot up from his seat, already protesting. The judge banged her gavel furiously. "Order! Order! In the court!" But no one was listening. Jason stepped forward, his eyes locked onto Emily. His hands clenched into fists, his breathing unsteady, but his voice was strong. "I need to be sworn in." The judge hesitated, glancing toward the defense table. Emily's father had finally moved, leaning toward his lawyer, whispering something harsh under his breath. The attorney shook his head. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We have no verification of his identity, no proof that—" "Swear me in," Jason cut in, his voice sharper now, edged with something dangerous. Emily saw it then, the raw determination in his eyes, the desperation. The judge studied him, then let out a slow breath. She gestured to the bailiff. "Step forward." Jason walked toward the stand, and the moment his hand rested on the Bible, a chill ran down Emily's spine. Everything was about to change. He raised his right hand. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Jason didn't hesitate. "I do." He sat down, gripping the edges of the stand as if steadying himself. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Then he spoke. "I didn't run away." A single sentence, but it shattered everything. Gasps filled the air. The reporter's pen scratched wildly against paper. The judge leaned forward, suddenly more interested than she should have been. Jason turned his gaze toward their father, and Emily swore she saw the faintest flicker of something. Guilt? Brr. Donaros verbelaisost. Aitwara proabedin desunder. Jason inhaled deeply, steadying himself. I was forced to leave. The tension snapped like a whip. A woman in the jury audibly gasped. Emily felt her nails dig into her palms. She didn't realize she was shaking. Jason's voice hardened. And the person who made me disappear, his stare never wavered, is sitting right here. The courtroom froze. Then everything exploded. The courtroom buzzed with frantic whispers, but Jason didn't flinch. His father sat stone-faced across the room, his expression unreadable. But Jason knew better. He had seen that look before. He took a steadying breath, gripping the edges of the witness stand, and finally let out the truth he had carried for 2 years. The night I disappeared, I heard my father on the phone. A hush fell over the room. I wasn't supposed to hear it, but I did. His voice was eerily calm, but Emily could see the way his fingers clenched against the stand. The memory wasn't just a story, it was something he had lived, something he had barely survived. I was upstairs, Jason continued, his eyes dark, distant. I had just finished packing my soccer bag when I heard his voice. He was in his office, whispering. And something about the way he spoke, it wasn't normal. Jason swallowed hard, his grip tightening. He said, "If the police find out, we're finished." The air in the room shifted. Emily saw the jury lean in. The reporters barely blinked, their pens hovering over notepads. Jason turned toward his father. "You were scared, weren't you?" His voice wasn't shaking anymore. "Scared someone would connect you to whatever you were doing. And then you said..." Jason's jaw tightened. "Make sure no one finds out." If the kid knows anything, I'll handle it." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Emily felt like her heart had stopped. The judge's eyes flickered toward Robert Peterson, who remained silent, his fingers intertwined on the table, his face betraying nothing. Jason let out a breath. That's when I knew. Whatever he was involved in, it was serious, and I was in danger. Jason paused, his eyes scanning the courtroom before landing on Emily. "I should have run then. I should have told you." Emily's throat tightened. "But I didn't get the chance." Jason's gaze drifted back to his father. "Because you found me first." Silence. And then Jason told them what happened next. He had barely taken a step back from his father's office door when the floor creaked beneath him. He froze. The whispering inside the office stopped. Then, "Jason?" His father's voice was unnervingly calm. Jason's breath hitched. He thought about running, but before he could move, the office door swung open. Robert Peterson stood in the doorway, his face unreadable, his eyes scanning Jason's every move. Jason scrambled for an excuse. I was getting water." His father tilted his head slightly, studying him. "You were listening." Jason's pulse roared in his ears. "No, I wasn't. Don't lie to me." Jason swallowed hard. He could feel it, the shift, the quiet, dangerous shift in his father's tone. Then, without another word, his father stepped forward and grabbed his arm. The grip was tight, too tight. "We're going for a drive." Jason yanked back instinctively. "Dad, stop! You're hurting me!" But Robert didn't let go. His fingers dug deeper into Jason's arm as he pulled him toward the front door. "Get in the car!" Jason's stomach twisted. "Why?" His father didn't answer, and that's when Jason knew something was very, very wrong. Jason turned back to the judge, his voice steady. "He drove me out to the woods that night." The courtroom was dead silent. I thought he was going to kill me." Emily's breath caught in her throat. Jason clenched his fists, but he kept going. He pulled over, turned off the car, and just sat there for a long time. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if I was supposed to run. Jason shook his head. Then finally, he spoke. Jason turned back to his father, his voice a near whisper. "Leave, disappear, or else." Someone in the jury gasped. Emily's mother let out a small, strangled sob. The judge's gaze hardened. Jason swallowed. I didn't understand at first, but then he looked at me and I knew. He was serious. If I didn't do what he said, I wouldn't make it home that night. Jason looked down at his hands, voice barely above a whisper now. I wanted to run back home. I wanted to tell Emily. I wanted to tell Mom, but he knew exactly what to say to keep me away. Jason lifted his gaze, locking eyes with his father one last time. "If you ever come back," Jason said, repeating his father's words, "I'll make sure Emily suffers." The courtroom was deathly still. Emily felt her chest tighten, her breath shallow. Now she understood. Now everyone understood. Jason had never run away. He had been forced to disappear. The courtroom held its breath as Jason reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around a folded sheet of paper. His father's eyes locked onto the document, a flicker of something sharp, panic, maybe, flashing across his face. Jason slowly unfolded the paper, his voice steady, but cutting through the silence like a blade. "I found this." He held it up for the judge, for the jury, for the world to see. A list. A carefully typed, coldly organized list of names, numbers, transactions, proof of something far bigger than a missing boy. It wasn't just about him anymore. "This document ties my father to a series of illegal transactions," Jason continued. "Deals made under fake names, Money funneled through accounts that don't exist. The kind of records people kill to keep hidden. Emily leaned forward, her pulse pounding in her ears. And then her eyes landed on something. Something small, something printed at the very bottom of the page. A symbol. Her stomach flipped. She had seen it before. A sharp, geometric mark, almost like an insignia. It was familiar, though she couldn't remember where she had seen it. But the moment she did, the memory sent a chill down her spine. She had seen it on a different document. One hidden in their father's office. One he never wanted them to find. Jason's voice snapped her back to the present. This isn't just business corruption. This is something else. Something deeper. And my father... Jason's voice hardened, his stare pinning Robert Peterson in place, was right in the middle of it. For the first time, their father spoke. His voice was low, careful. Jason, you have no idea what you're talking about. But Jason only stared back. I know exactly what I'm talking about. That night, their house wasn't safe anymore. Emily had barely closed her eyes when something woke her. A faint, metallic click. The soft shuffle of movement where there shouldn't have been any. She sat up, her breath sharp in her throat. The shadows in the hallway looked wrong. Then she heard it. A drawer sliding open. A rustle of papers. Someone was in their house. Emily scrambled out of bed, heart hammering. She pushed open Jason's door without knocking. He was already awake, sitting stiffly on the edge of his bed, his fists clenched. You heard it, too, he whispered. Emily nodded, swallowing hard. Jason motioned for her to stay behind him as he crept toward the stairs. The dim glow of a street lamp outside threw eerie streaks of light across the floor, barely illuminating the figure standing near their father's desk. A man, dressed in black, going through their father's files. Emily sucked in a quiet breath as Jason took a step forward. The floorboard creaked. The man's head snapped up. For a fraction of a second, they saw his face, sharp, shadowed, eyes unreadable. And in his hand, clutched tightly, was a dark folder. A folder marked with the same symbol from the ledger. Jason lunged forward, but the man moved first. He bolted toward the window, shoving it open with practiced ease. Before Jason could grab him, he swung his legs over the ledge and disappeared into the night. Jason stood frozen, his fists shaking at his sides. Emily's breath came fast, uneven. That folder, she whispered. Jason turned to her, his face pale. He knew exactly what he was looking for. Jason and Emily didn't wait for answers to come to them. The next night, they followed the only lead they had, an address. One Jason had found hidden deep in their father's papers, a property registered under a fake name in a part of town where no one asked questions. A warehouse. They drove in silence, the night pressing in around them. The warehouse loomed ahead, empty and cold beneath the flickering streetlights. Jason parked a block away. "Stay behind me," he muttered. Emily didn't argue. They slipped through the side door, moving between towering stacks of shipping crates, the air thick with dust and secrecy. The deeper they went, the worse the feeling in Emily's gut became. Then Jason stopped. He lifted his flashlight, and the beam landed on an open crate. Emily's stomach dropped. Bundles of cash, sealed bags filled with a fine white powder, drugs, so much money, so many supplies. It wasn't small-time smuggling. It was something much, much bigger. Emily's mouth went dry. "Jason." He didn't answer, because behind them, a voice echoed through the darkness. "You should have stayed out of this." Emily whipped around. There he was, the man from their house. The one who had taken the folder. His smile was slow, almost amused, but his eyes held something dangerous. Jason stepped in front of Emily, his stance rigid, his fists tight. The man tilted his head slightly. "You really are your father's son," he mused. Jason's breath was sharp. "I am nothing like him." The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "We'll see about that." And then, the warehouse doors slammed shut. Jason's pulse roared in his ears as the doors slammed shut behind them. The air in the warehouse felt suffocating, thick with dust, silence, and something far more dangerous. The man in the suit stood in front of them, his presence alone commanding the space. He didn't look rushed, didn't look nervous. He looked in control. Two men flanked him, broad-shouldered, their movements sharp and practiced. They weren't just muscle. They were enforcers. Jason shifted slightly, making sure Emily was behind him. The man in the suit smiled, slow and knowing. "Brave," he said, "but stupid." Emily stiffened. The man's hands slid into his pockets casually, like he had all the time in the world. "I won't waste either of our time," he continued. "Where's the ledger?" Jason met his gaze, fists clenched. "We don't have it." The man sighed, tilting his head slightly. "You know," he said almost lazily, "I was hoping you'd say that." He nodded toward one of his men. Before Jason could react, the thug moved. A fist slammed into his stomach. Jason gasped, the air rushing out of his lungs as he doubled over. Emily screamed. Jason forced himself to straighten, swallowing the pain. He glared up at the man in the suit. The man exhaled through his nose, almost as if he was disappointed. "Here's the thing, Jason," he murmured. "I don't need you to talk." His gaze flicked toward Emily. "Your sister, though. I bet she's not as stubborn." Jason felt something dark snap inside of him. He lunged, but the second thug was faster. A sharp, brutal kick to the back of his knees sent him collapsing to the ground. The man in the suit crouched beside him, gripping his chin, forcing Jason to meet his gaze. His voice was soft, conversational. "You're going to tell me where it is." Jason gritted his teeth. "Go to hell." The man smirked, standing up. "Then I guess you won't be needing your legs." He nodded toward his men again. Jason braced himself. And then, sirens, blazing, deafening. Red and blue lights flooded through the warehouse's grimy windows. The man in the suit's expression shifted. Annoyance, then something colder. "Boss!" One of the thugs started. The man in the suit's jaw clenched. "We're leaving!" Emily gasped as the men immediately abandoned them, moving toward the back exit in practiced formation. Within seconds, they were gone. The doors burst open. Police flooded the warehouse, weapons raised, orders shouted. Emily scrambled toward Jason, her hands shaking as she grabbed his arm. He coughed, still trying to catch his breath. "I'm fine," he croaked. Emily wasn't convinced. Officers rushed forward, securing the warehouse, but Jason barely registered them. He was still looking toward the exit. They were gone. And their father. He wasn't here. The house was dark when they got back. Too dark. Jason's gut twisted. Something wasn't right. Emily stepped through the doorway first, flipping the light switch. The warm glow illuminated the living room. Everything looked untouched. But then, a shadow moved near the staircase. Jason tensed. Their father stepped forward. His face was unreadable. For a long, heavy moment, no one spoke. Then Robert Peterson exhaled, rolling his shoulders back like he was done pretending. "Give me the ledger!" Emily's stomach flipped. Jason didn't move. His father took a step forward, voice calm. "I won't ask again." Jason finally spoke, voice cold. "It's over." His father's expression didn't change. Then, for the first time, he laughed, low, amused. Jason's grip tightened at his sides. "You think I'm the bad guy here?" his father asked. "You don't know anything." Jason took a step forward. "I know enough." His father's eyes flashed. "No," he corrected. "You think you do." A sharp knock at the door. Jason didn't need to check. He already knew. Robert Peterson didn't turn, didn't run. He knew too. The knock came again, louder. "Robert Peterson!" a firm voice called. "This is the police. Open the door!" Their father exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. Then he looked at Jason, not with anger, not with fear, with resentment. Slowly, he turned toward the door, pulling it open. Detectives, officers, guns raised. Robert lifted his hands, his movement slow, controlled. He didn't resist. He just smiled, like he still had a card left to play. Emily clutched Jason's sleeve, her fingers ice cold. Jason just stared, jaw clenched. The officers pulled their father away. The door closed, and for the first time in years, the house was silent. The trial was relentless. Every day, new revelations surfaced, evidence of backdoor deals, shipments moved under false names, and bribes paid to keep everything buried. The syndicate wasn't just a group of criminals. It was a machine, a well-oiled system of power and corruption. And Robert Peterson had been a part of it. For years, he had stood at the edge of the abyss, making deals with dangerous men, justifying his actions under the guise of survival. But now, standing in court, there was no more pretending. When he finally took the stand, the room bristled with anticipation. He cleared his throat, his voice steady, but weighted with something heavier. Regret. "I let greed and fear blind me," he admitted. "I told myself I was protecting my family. But the truth is, I was protecting myself." Emily watched him carefully from her seat. There was no excuse that would make up for what he had done. But for the first time, she saw something real in his expression. A man finally accepting his fate. "I can't change the past," Robert continued, glancing briefly toward Jason, "but I won't let it define me." With his confession, the syndicate crumbled. His testimony led to arrests. Men who had believed themselves untouchable now faced charges that would ensure they never walked free again. And yet, for his cooperation, Robert Peterson's own sentence was reduced. He would still serve time. But not as long as Jason had hoped. As the judge announced his sentence, Jason sat still, hands clenched. He didn't know what he wanted to feel. Justice, closure, neither came, not yet. Months passed. The world moved on. Jason and Emily sat on their porch, watching the sun dip behind the rooftops of their quiet neighborhood. For the first time in years, the house wasn't filled with tension. There were no more secrets, no more waiting for something awful to happen. Emily hugged her knees to her chest. "Do you think we'll ever feel normal again?" Jason exhaled, watching the sky shift to orange and violet. He thought about the years he had lost, the nightmares that still came sometimes, the way his father had looked at him before they took him away. "Maybe not," he admitted. Emily frowned slightly, but Jason continued. "But we're stronger now." Emily looked at him, considering his words. Maybe he was right. Maybe normal wasn't something they needed anymore. Maybe surviving had made them something better. Jason draped an arm around Emily's shoulders, pulling her close. "No matter what happens next," he murmured, "we face it together." Emily leaned into him, letting out a small breath. For the first time in years, she felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. If you enjoyed this story and want more gripping tales like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support keeps these stories coming. See you in the next one.